Alexei Navalny and Russia's millennia-old siege mentality. Gerald did his PhD from Cambridge. His research spans historical periods from the Khazars to Imperial Russia and Soviet Union. His interests include the conversion to Islam in Central Asia, to Soviet and Russian nation building, and questions of identity to the future of energy in Central Asia. He's worked extensively with UNDP, Gates Foundation, WHO, Commonwealth Secretariat. He's worked on cross-border educational initiatives supporting Syrian refugees recently, and he's been advising various governments on matters of sustainability, education, and local governance. So Gerald, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Projecting.
Oh, we're starting recording. Sorry.
Well, then I think I can thank afterwards. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope everyone is having a lovely and very sunny Friday. In what follows, I think for the next 50 minutes, I will be indeed talking about the topic mentioned, provided I can launch shares. I think we were, if we can, around here. I do hope that you can see. And this is not my browser history. So Navalny being called even 8 years ago the single most important politician in the country.
Could you project the presentation? Right now it's just so we can see that.
I think I am sharing. Nope.
No, sharing is fine. It's a projection. You're not using it as a PowerPoint.
Is it better now?
Yeah, now.
Great. Okay. I'm afraid I can't blame the North Koreans for that. So anyhow, 8 years ago, he was already called the most dangerous man in the country by Western media. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this Western, well, quote marks, is that obviously it takes time for the media in other countries to catch up. So in Russia, he was already pretty well known when American and European publications and publications all around the world started to deal with him around the early 2000s. And the question indeed begs for itself, who is he? Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we don't really have time to dwell deeply into Alexei Navalny's roots, but I will just present two pictures as far as his portrayal goes. One I really love, it's a superb touch. Viktor Orban would approve, the George Soros, well, very handsome, slightly devilish, well, fitting to the slide picture, who takes money. I hope you realize those are US dollars, which is a wonderful, harder currency, especially when the ruble is, well, that weak as it's been since the annexation of the Crimea. Or is he an angel? And I really love the second picture. Now, it's very hard to tell. One can say, of course, that the picture is indeed extremely obvious if you look for Russian state media and media in friendly countries. That includes some journalists even from Scotland who argue that Navalny is an oppositional leader because, frankly, he doesn't have a job. And of course, who doesn't want to be in a panel colony? Because they don't have anything else to do. I, for one, have a great many ideas what you can do instead of being there. Still, as mentioned, and I think this is where we stopped, I leave it to your imagination who said, or rather which side said this about him. I think the West darling is almost a sympathetic thing to say to great many in Russia, and I will come back to this a bit later. Now, as far as May the 21st goes, I'm pretty sure most of you know Navalny was poisoned last August. Then he was released to Germany, where he returned, this January, and now he's serving his more than 2 years sentence, which is likely only the beginning of the end for him. But of course, what will the end entail? Well, nobody knows, and that remains to be seen. And of course, media loves to create lip-sided images, hence what I was mentioning a minute earlier. And well, nowadays we can't even be sure about that. What is fake news? What is the truth? If there is anything even comes close to the truth. One thing is quite certain. when it comes to Alexei Navalny and Western, once again, quote marks, media, it is very much blurred with general images of Russia. I have no idea why the crescent moon is so prominent, presumably because I spent so much time recently in Turkey. Yet, I'm pretty sure all of you know this image. And if the Kremlin is that terrible, then whoever fights against it, in whatever shape or form, should be a really, really nice guy. Or, well, maybe not, or maybe both. Now, on that note, we'll definitely be not dealing with images of Vladimir Putin, because unfortunately, that wouldn't fit our roughly 50 minutes, from which I managed to consume around 10 minutes trying to attend my router, nor will this talk address one of the fundamental questions: what will happen in the next elections? And I do mean elections, not necessarily the next one. Is there any hope for Russia's opposition? Or indeed, will there be anyone else who can replace Mr. Putin once he will get slightly older than he already is? And well, he's approaching 70 very fast. Instead, we'll be dealing with, again, media coverage and Navalny, some of his thoughts and the controversies around it. The question being summed up pretty nicely in an article that's been released quite recently in the New Yorker, which most of us certainly love. For years, I've been content to be conflicted about Alexei Navalny. On the one hand, I thought he was an extraordinary, brave, inventive, and committed opponent of Vladimir Putin's regime. On the other hand, he had allied himself with ultranationalists and had expressed views that I found extremely objectionable and potentially dangerous. And, well, that's a problem that generally media around the world, if that is to some extent at least independent, been trying to address, that here's a man who is seemingly fighting a crusade against that very evil bear in Kremlin, even though that bear represents Russia, so that's a paradox in itself. But he's not necessarily spotless. Indeed, he can be called in, well, even a while, why supremacist, because of his views. To the extent, and in case you're wondering, yes, I'm waiting for the cliffhanger a bit later when I'm going to discuss his views, to the extent that 3 months ago, Amnesty International stripped him of the prisoner of conscience status, arguing that they believed the wave of requests to delist Navalny was part of an orchestrated campaign to discredit, well, Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic. But eventually they had to take into consideration the evidence, and that pointed to Navalny not being a Gandhi-esque politician, but rather somebody who expressed these views that, again, I'm waiting a little bit to present to you. They also stated that he has not publicly denounced his YouTube videos, and well, there is nothing new in stripping people of their status, as Nelson Mandela was stripped in the 1960s. Amnesty International will feeling somewhat confused of his decision because they did admit that the wave of requests was likely coming from very organized sources, that is from the Kremlin, because this is a wonderful way to discredit Mr. Navalny for views he certainly did held. And what's really interesting is that these views, which contain or did contain a lot of indeed Russian nationalist, racist elements, are not exactly unknown to the Kremlin, not the official stance on Central Asian migrants or racism as it goes. The Kremlin would never do that, and Russian state would never do that. But nationalism, as far as Russian nationalism goes, that is very close to the heart of the rulers of the Kremlin. So them pointing to Navalny as somebody who's been using such ideology or indeed been supporting it is quite ironic. Now, just to finally arrive to that wonderful cliffhanger, in case some of you are slightly confused, what the hell am I talking about? Hopefully this video won't cause my router to collapse again. Even if you don't speak Russian, it's very easy to understand the basic message. Well, these are, I think that was from Men in Black. How can you deal with various bugs? What are the solutions for bugs? Well, there's one solution, that's a very cute solution, but what can you do with Muslims? Well, you can shoot them. This video was released in 2007, and I think it is a fairly strong reminder of the views Navalny had held at the time. And this is one of the main reasons, and of course several other videos followed and his views that I'm going to shed light on, that many in Western media, which is of course not a unified thing, and I'm using it just to spare time, we're slightly confused about who he is. Is he an anti-immigrant nationalist who can be trusted? He's somebody who certainly should not be idealized, and whether he's closer to Mandela or he's closer to the current Burmese president. Well, what are the reasons for this, aside from love of the videos I showed? So one is, he used to, at least for a period around, well, 6-7 years, used racial slur and basing his relations with people on their ethnicity, emphasis on those from the Caucasus and those from Central Asia. I'm going to explain that a bit later. He did also support the war with Georgia, something nowadays certain Kremlin-friendly media outlets, when they're presenting their information to Western audiences, mention as something of a terrible thing, even though the war was launched by the Kremlin. He didn't need calls for deporting illegal migrants and introducing a visa regime for tourists from Central Asia. And he did support the annexation of the Crimea. And this is the Navalny bomb, even though it bears curious resemblance to Netflix logo. I'm pretty sure at some point there will be a Hollywood movie out of this very soon. But if you take these four major things into consideration, you reach the conclusion it's very hard and indeed, as mentioned, confusing for media outlets to portray him as the hero they want to see. And in about 8 years ago, he did publish a nationalist agenda. He called it a realistic agenda, which said at combating illegal migration and ethnically based organized crime groups, protecting Russians abroad, bringing order to the North Caucasus, which he has called a lawless offshore zone. Now, when it comes to, and we have to differentiate between two things, migrants from Central Asia, which is very close to the work of the Central Asia Forum, and those from the Caucasus, which is also very close. And he said that those who are here, we know and believe that there are also normal people in the Caucasus, not only those freaks who are in power. We know that there are girls there whose life ambition is not about being wrapped up in a burqa and having 25 children, quite an achievement, I would say, but about living a decent life like humans. There are young people who want to study and work, and their ideal of life is not a Porsche Cayenne and a golden gun. He said this a bit less than 10 years ago. Now, in itself, this rhetoric sounds eerily familiar if one thinks about anti-Muslim parties across Europe, and sometimes even voices in the US. But of course, one has to put this into a Russian context. What does he mean by Porsche Cayennes, which is a massive understatement? After all, that's a semi-middle-class car in the Caucasus. Well, he was referring to some of the most wonderful leaders in the region. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this young gun, pun intended. This picture was taken about 18 years ago, even though that's only a gold-plated gun. Since then, he definitely acquired Mr. Kadyrov great many pure golden guns. And of course, he has a great affinity for cars, finely decorated according to modern standards. The Caucasus, in this case for Navalny's rhetoric, is not something necessarily a source of migration, but a source of gangs, terror, and indeed money spent not through the right, well, not towards the right goals. For example, a bit more than 10 years ago, he criticized the finance minister of Dagestan, who had, acquired himself a car in 2011 exchange rates for more than €1 million. And this later on, and even then rather, became a quintessential feature of Mr. Navalny's arguments, that he was, even when he was attacking some people with some extent of racial slur, or indeed based on religion and regional grievances, he was trying to pinpoint the financial side of things. And later on, this became the most important thing in his agenda. But for example, a few years ago, during the height of Russia's intervention in Syria, he said that, well, the geopolitical gains are limited to the pages of the Pravda, and it would be doing far better to spend the monies on the state pension fund, for example. So these two things went hand in hand together, his racially fueled comments, and later on these were overtaken by those of financial considerations. And if those of you who saw that, well, fairly infamous video that was released around 4 months ago, you know that his main argument was about how monies are being appropriated and put into, well, not exactly the right pockets. And corruption is the main problem in Russia. Recently, he dropped what I was talking about. Yet, when he was very much involved in nationalist agendas, he, for example, participated in the annual Russian marches. And these were, well, when we say Russian marches, it was not exactly like this. It was more like this. And his arguments were fairly much on not only a racist ground, but as mentioned, on economic grounds. He was arguing that Russia does not need more migrants from Central Asia. And some of you might be wondering, what are we talking about with migrants from Central Asia? Why are they a target? Why they were a target? Well, officially, these are the latest figures. There were about 1.8 million migrants from Central Asian countries working in Russia legally. Now, legally is very important. In reality, estimates range from 2.5 to 6 million, and likely, at least in my opinion, even that is a bit of an understatement. And their role is quite vital for great many industries in Russia. They work in heavy industries. They work in somewhat less glamorous jobs. As once a reasonably well-known figure in Russia said, unfortunately, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, fine Slavic people don't want to clean the streets at -30. Well, does this sound familiar? Well, certainly it does to Western ears. They are taking our jobs. They are coming from a different culture. We have to defend ourselves against these people. After all, they are coming, well, literally by the millions. And as mentioned, this is something that sounds eerily familiar when it comes to our ears, because several political parties exactly saying the same about migrants for decades in the UK, in France, in Italy, in Spain, in various shapes and forms. But what's somewhat unique in this case is that Russia has a very different relation with Central Asian countries that you can see here. Now, for all intents and purposes, when it comes to migration, please ignore that big, wonderful green country, Kazakhstan, because the Kazakhs are not really migrating to Russia. Their GDP is higher than that of Russia's, subject to oil and gas prices, and Turkmenistan, that also should be ignored because Turkmens, for most part, are not really going to work in Russia. However, Uzbeks do, Kyrgyz do, and Tajiks do. And this kind of, we are besieged, these people are coming, being very much connected. Really sorry, and thank you for your patience. Just to bounce back, and hopefully for the last time. Yes, very quickly. Yes, pictures of handsome man are very slow to move. So this is where we were. And to resume to our soap opera, which might actually going to return in an hour's time, just in case my router are going to die again. This is to some extent a past. Navalny, about 8 years ago, realized that the way to capture Russian audiences, well, at least those who are well, figured that the future not necessarily lie forever with Mr. Putin and his regime, is not through racist slur, but rather, and I already hinted on this, economic considerations. And indeed, he tried to, and he still tries, well, not currently because he's locked up, to soften his tone on migration. He's advocating a visa regime from Central Asian countries and came out to support, for example, same-sex marriage. So in many ways, he stirred to the center, to the left. But, and this is very important, he, for most part, never apologized for the comments he made. And this led to great many to believe that he's a very tactical politician. Nobody can argue, and nobody's arguing about that he's a very talented man who, just like politicians or activists very often do, he's seeking pathways, how to find a greater audience, how to find, well, rather to how increase his popularity for whichever cause. And in this case, that is to include change in Russia. And because of this, he's moving towards the center. But once again, he never declared, for at least for most of his comments, he never really apologized. And one can say that this is all fine, this is easy to understand, migration, races, Muslims, what's the big deal? I mean, it is terrible, but what makes it unique in a Russian context, as opposed to what I mentioned earlier, similar voices in Western Europe, for example? Well, the case is, and that is what was somewhat close to my own research, is that his notions on migrant workers, or indeed Muslims, have very, very deep historical roots. Russia, or rather Russian Empire that preceded the Soviet Union, was one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. Here you can see how it was expanding from the north, that is the golden, well, not the Golden Horde, but the golden parts up in the north, eventually conquering pretty much all of the northern landmass of Asia, and then further expanding during the 19th century to the south, conquering much of Central Asia. And even though the empire, which as we all know, is transformed to the Soviet Union, which fell apart in 1991, or rather it dissolved itself, is gone. Russia still is it is the largest country in the world, not an empire anymore, of course. And it is home to almost 200 different peoples that range from around a bit more than 5 million people in Volga, in Tatarstan, around the Volga, to merely 64 people of the votes. I think, unfortunately, now the number for the votes is around 56. It was from 2017, this data. And one can say that, okay, we understand. So lots of people lived in Russia for a long time. How is this connected to notions about, very negative notions about Muslims? Indeed, how is it actually connected to the second part of the presentation, or rather the topic inclined, the Russia's siege mentality? Well, even though Russia at some point became one of the largest empires in history, this was not always the case. And this lovely, incredibly pixelish map, you can see what can be described as the Golden Horde, which was coming from the Mongol Empire. It was, let's just say, the western part of it, without wanting to spend too much time on this. And the Mongols did defeat the Russians, or rather the Russian principalities, and this resulted in what is called the Tatar yoke. When I say Tatar yoke, it doesn't sound too positive, isn't it? I was really looking for a picture that is sufficiently, well, colorful and scary. This is how people generally imagine nomads. And this is the image that was planted. Or rather, it was planted in generations of Russians' minds about, well, people in the East, mostly Tatars, but also others, savage warriors who annihilated the Russians, who forced them into this Asiatic slavery. I'm using quotations here. And this fundamentally changed the way Russia developed, indeed, between West and East. And just to quote something that sounds very familiar to what I've said previously about Navalny's notions, Nikolai Razmin, who was a great 19th century Russian historian, who was, to some extent, greatly surprisingly, not inheritedly hostile towards all things Asian, because the notion about his time was that everything great stems from Europe and everything else in Asia is something bad, terrible, not too developed. Even he said that what could civilized people have learned from, well, nomads? And this is something, once again, that is quite familiar to what Navalny said in a speech, that what could possibly Central Asian migrants bring to Russia? He doesn't see the point. What could? And to go a bit further, as mentioned, the Mongols did conquer the Russians, even though, and this would be very much off topic, they did leave them to develop on their own ways. The siege mentality, which was already present in various Russian principalities, especially those in the south, the remnants of the Kievan Rus, who were in contact with the nomads for centuries, and what is nowadays Ukraine and the South Russian steppes was literally a frontier, and in many ways no man's land. So when the Russians, instead of dwelling on various principalities, let's live as Russians, were fighting against the Mongols, a minor incident, a truly small thing that happened, namely that the Teutonic Order, who were this time conquering much of Prussia and waging their crusades against the pagans there, and Sweden exploited the Russian vulnerability and attacked the Novgorod Republic, which was one of the Russian principalities. And even though they had no intention whatsoever to conquer Russia, which didn't exist at that time, this episode left a very deep imprint on the mindset of people, because it was, and he's extremely well known to anyone who is familiar with Russian history, Alexander Nevsky eventually defeated the Swedes and the Teutonic Knights. And there were lovely movies about this even in the 1930s, and he was canonized. I'm pretty sure some of you are thinking, what the hell am I talking about? Excuse my French. We're talking about Central Asian migrants, the Mongols. Now, this is about some European incursion to Russia while the Mongols were attacking. Now, there is a very strong correlation, namely that future rulers of the country did embrace this heritage. Various military honors were established, and the message was very simple. While Russia was fighting for its life literally against the Mongols, Europeans sinisterly and sneakily attacked it and stabbed it in the back. And even though that's water under bridge, in fact, nobody really remembers this in Sweden or Germany. In Russia, the memory of this was kept alive. This contributed, and this is one element of great many elements of this, to the siege mentality that represents that Russia is alone. Russia is being flooded by forces from the East, Asia, and meanwhile, Europe, this backstabbing entity, can never be trusted. Now, I don't want to dwell on Russia's relations with the West and with Europe length, but when it comes to siege mentality and Navalny's thinking, it was very much present. And in this case, actually, there's a very, very strong correlation with what the Kremlin been saying for the past, well, about 11, 12 years, that Russia is alone, Russia cannot trust anyone, and Russians can only rely on themselves. Now, in this context, it should also be mentioned, obviously, as mentioned, that Russia was an empire, and there was a massive difference between Russia was managing its empire and, for example, Britain or France was it. Those were overseas empires. The realm was literally distance from the conquering, colonizing country by oceans, seas. And this was not the case in Russia. That was one big landmass. And Babur, the famous Indian ruler, did not sack London. It sounds bizarre even to raise that question. I mean, how could he? It was thousands of miles away. Now, the Mongols did sack Moscow and conquered Kiev. And this left a very deep imprint for later, for centuries later, when Russia was conquering the very people that conquered them, starting with Ivan the Terrible in the mid-16th century when they conquered Kazan, and then moved further east. This notion was there that we were fighting against these people. They conquered us. Now we're conquering them. And this type of cycle is very evident in, not that he ever said this in Navalny's speeches, but the notion that these people are here to undermine us. And this is far different from what you would find in, let's say, British nationalists, well, not really nationalists, would be the BNP, generally anti-migration topics, and relation to that people are taking our jobs. As Jimmy Carter said, we really have to defend ourselves from migration. We have to defend the jobs of our Polish people from these people who are coming. Now in Russia, it's very, very different because once again, those people did conquer Russia, not the exact people. Tajiks never conquered Russia. Uzbeks never been around. The Kazakhs, well, they did raid, but really, they never posed a threat. But identifying people who are coming from a certain part of the world and mixing them in our mindset with people who lived centuries before, well, that's not exactly a uniquely Russian thing to do. Indeed, when it comes to Muslims, They were very much looked down on the 16th century when Russia started to conquer various khanates during its expansion to the east. And they were looked down in the 19th century where Russia was pushing to the south, conquering eventually furthest to the south, Turkmenistan. And they were treated as something odd, alien to Russian culture, which was, of course, in great respects true. But then the question can be raised, what's with their descendants? And as mentioned, this is how the cycle starts or indeed begins, and it's a dragon constantly eating its tail. To understand this duality a bit further, if we have time, which I will try to finish soon without my router dying again, Dostoevsky, who needs no introduction, said that it is hard for us to turn away from our window on Europe, but it is a matter of our destiny. When we turn to Asia with our new view on her, something of the same sort may happen to us as happened to Europe when America was discovered. With our push towards Asia, we will have renewed upsurge of spirit and strength. In Europe, we were hangers-on and slaves, while in Asia, we shall be the masters. In Europe, we were Tatars, while in Asia, we can be Europeans. And this is very important. The notion that Russia is culturally superior to, as opposed to, say, Central Asia or the Caucasus. These views, what Navalny been expressing so vocally, were not coming from his own head, but rather these were building on centuries and centuries of Russian history. And then, of course, you can say again, what is he talking about? And this is ancient history. Fair, it might bear on his views, but why is this of great importance? Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia underwent a somewhat peculiar change. Peculiar, I mention it because nowhere else in the former Eastern Bloc, as far as Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe is concerned, this similar change happened when it comes to the importance of religion related to Russian identity. In 1997, there was a new law that was created that says that even though it respects Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, and other religions, which constitute an integral part of the historical heritage of the peoples of Russia, it did establish that Russian identity is in many ways based on Orthodox values. And for the past 20 years, we have seen that the church became more and more prominent as far as Russian identity goes. And again, whether you look for Poland, where it was already very, very strong, the Czech Republic, Ukraine, but it's somewhat different, Hungary or Slovakia, there was no similar change as far as religion goes. And here, once again, the importance is not necessarily on religion, but identity. Fuse that Russian identity and orthodoxy are one and the same, even though there are millions of people living in Russia who are not Russians. Russians constitute about 80% of Russia's population, not counting, as mentioned, illegal migrants by the millions. So this new development definitely fueled what reached its peak about 10 years ago, this massive upsurge of Russian nationalism. Thus, again, in this respect, Navalny's views were not coming out of blue. Indeed, when it comes to his views and those of the Kremlin, one might look back to a very famous diplomat who played a major role in the Soviet containment policy after World War II. He was an American diplomat. And what he said, this is so-called the long telegram. Well, I know it's a very creative name. It's called long telegram because it is incredibly long. And he was assessing already just at the very beginning of the Cold War. We were just when Churchill said that there is a Cold there is an Iron Curtain descending on Europe. Keenan was already assessing the situation, which in many ways seem a bit outdated. Well, it's from 1946, yet it does sound somewhat familiar with anyone who's been following news in Russia. That at the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of the world affairs is traditionally and indistinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Originally, this was insecurity of a peaceful agricultural people trying to live on vast exposed plain in neighborhood of fierce nomadic peoples. This is what I mentioned. To this was added, as Russia came into contact with economically advanced West, fear of more competent, more powerful, more highly organized societies in that area. But this latter type of insecurity was one which afflicted rather Russian rulers than Russian people. For Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile and artificial in its psychological foundation, unable to stand comparison or contact with political systems of Western countries. Once again, we're in 46, he's definitely speaking. For this reason, they have always feared foreign penetration, feared direct contact between Western world and their own, feared what would happen if Russians learned truth about world without of its foreigners, about world without of its foreigners, learn truth about world within. And they have learned to seek security only in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of rival power, never in compacts and compromises with it. Now, I know this is not about nomads, this is not about Central Asia, this is not about Muslims from the Caucasus. This is about the siege mentality I mentioned. And if one is interested, how is this connected to Navalny? And just to close the talk. Well, if one scratches his views, the views he was holding for years and for the past years been trying to sugarcoat them and present them in a somewhat buttressed fashion as far as Russian freedom, anti-corruption goes, one finds that his views are not exactly different from the views held by the Kremlin. Not about races, once again, I would never imply that, but about Russia being a besieged fortress, Russia being the superior civilizational force in this region and so forth. One finds actually that views are remarkably similar. Now, before some of you would run away from this presentation, which maybe there is no need for it should the North Koreans attack again, and am I arguing that the grand conclusion of this talk, which is ranging from Navalny's notions and their roots, is that, well, are they ideologically equal? Certainly not. Absolutely not. Yet, it should be mentioned that there are certain similarities, and both the thinking of the Kremlin and both the thinking of Navalny be shaped by Russia's historical memory. And this runs, when I speak of historical memory, this runs far, far deeper than a few decades or even a couple of centuries. This goes back to basically a millennia. And when Navalny is arguing against Central Asian migrants, he's using ideas that were already planted 500 years ago. And when the Kremlin is using its very, very strong Russia is a besieged fortress and the West is trying to undermine it rhetoric, it is also relying on centuries-old toposes. And in this case, it should be mentioned that Navalny never said that, well, Russia is not a besieged fortress. He truly believes that, or at least did believe, that whatever the Kremlin says about Russia's unique place justifying its actions is for most part true. He never said that, of course, but his logic was pointing towards this conclusion. And this greatly confuses observers, because we're not just talking about someone who was using, well, things that are kind of hard to put into the liberal savior category, but his logic when it comes to Russia's role in the world is remarkably similar to that of the Kremlin. How can that be? Because let's face it, when we talk about media, portrayals of the media, and the message contained within, we want to think of black and white. There's the devil, there is an angel fighting. And regardless of to what extent this image is true, which is, for most part, true, the reality, as always, is far more complicated than simplistic portrayals suggest. Navalny can indeed, and he is, a force of change in Russia. And we'll see, of course, well, will this lead whether he has a chance to succeed or not. But being an agent of change does not mean that somebody has to be a liberal, open-minded in the Western sense of the word person, or indeed in the Russian liberal sense of the word. It can be someone who's been harboring views that are very much incompatible, what we would consider a liberal, and a great many people in Russia would consider a liberal, yet it does not deduct but, well, nothing from his struggle. And, well, that is pretty much it. Thank you for your attention. That is the grand conclusion, that there is no grand conclusion aside from the fact that things never black or white, bar my router issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry. That was great. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes. Well, without dropping out?
Yes, please. Let's not have awkward silences again. Okay, the floor is open for questions and answers. Comments, criticisms, putting Jerry on the spot. Go for it. So hands, please raise your hands and then we'll unmute you. You could leave a question in the chat. We can do that too.
We have a question from Jakub already.
Jakub, yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you, Jerry, for the presentation. I have a question or a comment. So, I mean, the attitudes of, I just came back from a meeting with one person from the Caucasus who was actually reflecting on these, on her experiences in Russia. So it was kind of a nice link with that conversation. But I have a question whether, to explain the processes or the attitudes that you are talking about, if whether it wouldn't be more related to, let's say, more recent history, for example, the large-scale economic changes in 1990s, and rather than so isn't it in a way a long stretch to go to the the history of the past centuries, whether the kind of more recent developments or events can explain these kind of attitudes in a way, in a better way. Well, let's put it simply. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jakub. It's a great question indeed. And to start with, and that's the best comment I can give, you're absolutely right. When it comes to explaining what is happening with Central Asian migrants in Russia as of 2021, one needs to go back to the 1990s, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the economic collapse, the relatively not sparkling economic development in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. But my point wasn't about what caused these people to move, why they are there. I was merely trying to make a point about why the notions about them linger. If you talk, well, you would think, during interviews, like Navalny's notions about people from Central Asia were not reflecting on their current status. That is, people living in, cleaning the streets, living in cramped houses, so forth, so forth, so forth. But he was using terminology, and he was using notions that were very much rooted and are very much rooted in the past centuries. So these are two different things. One is their status and one is how they're viewed in Russia by many. And for that, you have to understand the history Russia had with nomads, the history Russia had, which is truly unique in world history. Colonial empires started to colonize nations, for most part, that were very far away from them. Well, I don't think the Irish would agree on that, but miles away, I mean, hundreds of miles, dozens of miles away, Russia started to conquer people that were conquering them before. And those people later on became protected minorities during the Soviet Union and minorities as of now. So this cycle or circle was vastly different from the colonial experiences of, say, Britain. And this did leave a massive imprint on people's mindset, whether they realize it or not.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. The next question, Najam, do you want to ask your question? No?
Thank you for the opportunity and very impressive presentation, Gerald. I recall a talk by Luke Harding where he said that he suspects Alexei Navalny not to be a genuine opposition figure, but a pseudo figure, pseudo opposition who would not pose a genuine challenge to Putin and would not be hence considered uh, a, a, um, a likely alternate. What would you say to that? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I think that would be a bit far-fetched. We all love conspiracy theories, and for the past half a year, I spent much of my time, as mentioned, in Turkey, where, everyone loves conspiracy theories. If it's raining, well, that's based on our enemies' wish to, well, I don't know, give us rain. If it's not raining, that's because of them. And so it's true that for the past 20 years, much of Russia's opposition, the communists even included, being forced into this semi-cooperative state where they are opposition, but they cannot oppose too hard. They cannot hope for victory in certain types of elections, but they can hope for local elections. It's a complicated landscape. But Navalny is one of the few, as far as certainty goes, that is truly somebody who is not simply the leader of the opposition, a face, but somebody who does pose a very credible threat to Vladimir Putin's regime. And credible is important. After he was poisoned, his popularity rose immensely for obvious reasons. And now that he returned to Russia, and he voluntarily went to prison, no semi-paid cooperative opposition politician would do that. Even though, again, I was reading, it was actually in the BRICS publication, the Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and so forth, that, well, Navalny just doesn't have any other job. So, he's the opposition politician because he doesn't know anything else. But let's be frank, no, he's one of the few very, very dedicated and truly opposition people in Russia.
Thanks, Jerry. Muntu, and then I'll ask Buzzbeck to unmute himself.
Actually, let Buzzbeck go first. I'll unmute him and then I'll come.
Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for interesting talk. My question relates to nationalist agenda in Russia. And the question is, what are Navalny's views on northern Kazakhstan lands claimed by Russian nationalists? Because this is the last territory which could be claimed by Russia after Georgia and Ukraine.
Well, thank you. For most part, Navalny has not been arguing for expansion whatsoever. I'm quite aware when it comes to Russian nationalism, or rather ultranationalism, it places great emphasis on recovering the lost lands, and people can understand it in whatever way they want. Navalny, for the most part, did not advocate much about that. He's far more concerned about defending, or was, hard to tell as far as May the 21st goes, defending Russia itself. So he's less of the expansionist type, or was. Once again, I know it's a bit confusing when I say yes and was, and he is. As mentioned, he never apologized openly for his views. Some he did when he was addressing Georgians with great racial slur, but he did move to the center. But for the most part, he never really attempted to hide that he's a nationalist politician. He's just choosing different angles and different avenues. But once again, he's more about defending the homeland than expanding it, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, so what I was going to say kind of intersects with what Bazbek brought up. So, Jerry, I mean, it's not even a question, it's a discussion that how to think about these things, how we interpret these two figures. I mean, we kind of post Putin versus Navalny in a sense. The first thing to remember is that in the recent history, meaning last sort of Soviet period and since then, the idea of opposition doesn't necessarily come from having different ideologies. The idea of opposition is simply opposition, that somebody wants power, and they're going to compete with you for that. That comes into the face of when you say, okay, so how, on what basis you're going to compete? What is your offer to the people? However notional the elections may or may not be, but you still have to have some narrative to bring to the table. And this is where two things come into picture. One is the nationalism, where this primordial story, as it built up, as you very well explained in the talk, runs in parallel with the. So okay, let me curtail that long discussion to say ethno-nationalism versus civic nationalism, and how these people cross across civic nationalism and ethno-nationalism is where a lot of the story lies, and especially that of Navalny. So very clearly, Putin and his group fix themselves to a civic nationalism, and they incorporate ethnos within it, and try to take control, like taking control of the church and other things and so on. Equally, the relationship with the Caucasus, I mean the Caucasus within North Caucasus within Russia, how they work with the Muslim narrative there and so on. While the more raw ethnic nationalism, which is what Navalny experimented with, and as you point out, failed with eventually, is important to note in conjunction with something totally different. So his movement towards this more center and even left liberal value system coincides with his resonance with the story in the West, particularly in the US and Europe, where the discussion really itself has moved from democracy promotion because of their own specific liberal, illiberal leaderships, Trump, etc., to the narrative of anti-corruption. And you can attend as many talks as you can these days on Zoom, etc., that how much of this corruption issue is part of the people who work on the post-Soviet space and promoting this. The same people who used to write extensively about notions of democracy before they used to write about the free market, and all of those things get now sliced into anti-corruption agenda, and that immediately resonates with where, the transformation of Navalny in the story. And this is particularly interesting in your own analysis. I have said a number of times, perhaps to you as well. Madina, we can see your hand. We'll let you come next. I have argued that there are certain similarities between Navalny and Orban, meaning that there is no idea of ideology. It's about power. So whatever one that suits at the moment, you grab onto, which creates a pathway, as you said. And I wondered that in your thinking, that particular analogy has any resonance with each other or not.
Yes, thank you. I think what you just said is very much true to most politicians in the world when it comes to, well, trying to grab power and trying to, and this comes to what we label as great politicians who can really feel the calling of times and move with it. There is an old Russian saying, how you know that a politician is lying? His or her mouth is moving. And of course, there are similar sayings all around the world. So I think in that respect, Navalny, obviously, he's a very, very clever person who sees the opportunity and he seized it at the right time and he changed at the right time. And in many ways, there is nothing wrong with that. Once again, we're talking about politics and, well, in the UK, ideas and arguments have been flying faster than one can reckon as to where does the glorious future lie. And what is really interesting again is that in many ways, the views he was holding or he is holding, and the views of the somewhat opportunist, slower to move Kremlin are remarkably similar. And many of these views, as you mentioned, for example, Viktor Orban and others, are fairly widespread. So I think in many respects, there is nothing unusual in the way Navalny conducts himself. And that very much fits into a general line of intellectual thought, if you like, with a very peculiar and very region-based thing when it comes to corruption. Yes, that is a massive problem all around the post-Soviet space bar, the Baltics. Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
Okay, Madina.
But every time I hear about Navalny, it's quite like this foreign policy image and especially migrant image for me. It's just I think it's important to look at Navalny critically, but as someone who like follows and is like resentful of his Central Asia view, but also kind of supportive of the democratic process. Everything, all of the events are, or all of these views are overshadowed by his potential to dismantle Russia's kleptocracy, because I think that's just kind of at the core of the issue, whereas all the other factors like, yeah, foreign and neighboring policy are just collaterals that are just kind of adjusted based on what he sees his support base is kind of believing. So I think it's extremely relevant, and I still think somehow Putin might be better for Central Asian policy, but for democratic reasons, for me, even as a Central Asian, it doesn't matter so much because it's a bit asymmetrical somehow. That's just kind of my reflection. That's all. Thank you for the talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to see that somebody's internet is even worse than mine. So thank you. You just did cheer me up.
Oh, sorry.
Jokes aside, I think this is one of the core messages of the talk, that there is no contradiction here. And this is something that is not that evident if one reads Western media, that once again, the contradiction is not there. Navalny can be an agent of change and can be a leader of change while having notions that are not exactly compatible with what we understand under liberal opposition. And I think this is what caused all the problems for example, Amnesty International. They are delisting somebody who just been sent to prison for his views and for his stance against the Kremlin. Yet they had to do it, even though they admitted that this was, for most part, a Kremlin orchestrated campaign to discredit Navalny for views held, well, again, aside from the racist part, very much for state Russian propaganda as well. That's very, very confusing for the average observer. But once again, in my opinion, and I wholly wholeheartedly agree with you. There is no contradiction. One can be an agent of change, and that is far more important than views held by him. But for, again, the casual observer, this is very confusing, because what we want to see, as was one of the penultimate, I think that was a penultimate slide, angels and demons, the good versus evil. It's so very obvious that someone is right and somebody is wrong. But what if they share much of their notions and ideas? Oh, goodness me, that's very confusing. So yes, I absolutely agree.
Sorry, I think Montu and I both are going to have to completely disagree with this whole thing. It's not only foreign policy. You're talking about 18% of the Russian population, which is Muslim. It's not only Central Asia, Asians in Kazakhstan and other parts, and Caucasus and outside of Russia. So you're talking about ethno-nationalism. You're bringing in somebody like Trump, or like Modi, or like you can name 100 other politicians, unfortunately, right now, who are leading countries, which are going. This is going to lead to whatever you think Russia is actually heading into. This is, I mean, I'm disappointed that people actually think like this. But anyway, Montu, do you want to?
Well, I would say that look at the fact of history that this, or Hitler was a fantastic, person at removing kleptocracy. He was fantastic at removing feudal system. And do we stop there? So we have to think very carefully about just focusing on what we have. We live in an ecosystem in which we made to believe this is the most important thing. The question is that who is calling out? Who is not kleptocratic at the moment? We are looking at the episode here with in UK with Boris Johnson. We are looking at whole story with Trump. We can go on, So the issue really lies here with understanding that we're not talking about Navalny doing something specifically bad, but we're talking about we don't see he's going to do something specifically good, and that particular strain is what I believe Jerry built clearly to say that how he's not even loyal to his own ideologies. He picks up what is popular, what resonates. How do you know he has any interest? Just like he had huge interest in stopping Caucasus and Muslim people, now he's dropped that interest because it's not popular. Now he's picked up the interest of kleptocracy. How do you know that he's sincere to that? This is becoming so, oh, well, he's being arrested for it, he's dying for it, or whatever else. Those are all correlation, causal, whatever else you want to call them, circumstantial is the word I'm looking for. It doesn't give me, if somebody had a consistent, whatever ideology, I would do my analysis based on that. Here we see a complete opportunism which comes in, and people are buying into that because they think this is the most important thing of the time. And that's, that would be my response to that.
Sorry, Medina has just written in chat that she's fixated on the democratic process, and I agree that democracy is important. But I'm Indian. I've seen what democracy does to a country. I'm sorry, I
yeah, no, I every time I go to Russia, I experience racism. It's a bit difficult. So
but I experienced racism in the UK, and this is a democracy. Sure, and I'm probably going to face racism in India now for different reasons. I'm a minority and all sorts of other things. So I'm all for the democratic process, but I don't think that it's right that we are putting somebody on a pedestal and not looking at his attitudes holistically. What Jerry actually showed is true. And I also don't agree with Yaqub's comment. I don't think this is the last couple of decades. The fact is that this is 1,000 years in the making. This is a continuation of racist and ethnic mindsets, which are now being accepted. They're accepted by certain parts in the world, which is completely unacceptable to somebody like me. The history is important. History is important because it shows the links, and Jerry has very, very well, he's shown that link really well. I'm not saying we should keep Putin in power, but I don't think I have the right to decide who to keep in power. But I'm definitely not. I can't support change just for the sake of change because I want to see a different president anywhere in the world. So I'm sorry.
I would add that, Medina, I don't see any specific movement from Navalny regarding democratic process. The being opposition doesn't mean that he's calling for any kind of democratic process to take place, right? That's not what he calls for. If that was the case, then his support for Crimea would not hold immediately. Stuff with Georgia would also be hugely problematic, and so on. I'm not saying that he's not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just more looking at it from an economic perspective, because if he kind of sticks to his mandates, which is like very anti-corruption, it means that the distributive economy might start kind of like there might be more of a distributive economy in Russia, which might empower, kind of lead to a rise in the middle class. So the change will come from that. So for me, I'm trying to like kind of weigh the benefits and disadvantages, and I agree it might lead to the oppression of large swathes of the public, but I think from like the kleptocracy perspective, there is a case to be made, and the ideological warfare that's going on between on Western media. Yeah, I agree. It's very power laden, and
the case study of the kleptocracy is always a fascinating one, because another group which came into power using the same narrative of social justice and kleptocracy were the mullahs in Iran. Shah was stealing everything. He was corrupt, taking away people's oil. Democratically, people voted. Mullahs in 99% vote. What happens next? You can count, and we can keep, So we can't simplify to that thing. That we have to look at the overall fabric of what's going to bring in the story. Obviously, we could be wrong. I mean, we should be asking really from academic point of view, who, if not Navalny, who else? Who else is there in that space who could bring more, equality and justice to overall process and economic prosperity to Russia? What are the processes there? Who else other than these two, which we get fixated on, who are actually more or less the same? So we don't have a choice. Jerry, I've taken over your talk.
Yeah, sorry. Other questions, comments? No. I mean, another question to ask while people. Okay, Kelly, go ahead. I'm unmuting her. Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, I guess just to kind of build on some of these discussive points. I mean, it's just interesting to see how this discontinued, disoriented view of Russia's historical past. I mean, since, as Pajaki was talking about, the last 500 years, not even just from the Soviet Union experience and then in the 90s, but how this almost becomes this soft power strategy, whereas it wouldn't be able to have any kind of, or at least for managing and navigating relations with the West, US and Europe, but that kind of tool doesn't seem to really be used or effective with making or establishing relations further east. That this kind of disillusioned understanding of the historical memory and telling of the Russia's past, that seems to be a very kind of consistent way in which it negotiates and makes relations with the West, and but that just doesn't seem to be a factor in the, whether you look at it from a foreign policy angle or more of a cultural kind of discussion or economic. That doesn't seem to be the case with rhetoric or discussions further east. So I'm just wondering or thinking if that's something that you've noticed, or if it is significant in any way, because by keeping that effectively, whether it's under Navalny, Putin, but that Russia doesn't have to necessarily deliver a clear vision of the future, and because it can continue to present itself as this great civilization that's continually subjected by Western, or that it's suffering from Western, I guess, meddling relations, or sorry, I don't know if it's making, if any of this is coming through. I don't have a specific question, but it was just more of an observation of how how Russia continues to present itself to the West, or how it's also narrated within the West. But that, I mean, do you see the similar patterns within its relations further east, or is this an effective soft power? It doesn't seem to be a tactic that's used because it doesn't have the same traction, presenting itself as a once great power that's sort of fallen away.
Well, thank you. Yes, I think there are like two elements of my response. One is that I think historical memory, as Projecti and I were touching on that in a moment as well, it certainly is important for any country in the world. And I think that's the not so grand first part, that, hey, great news, history is important everywhere to understand the 21st century. But, and I think there is a big difference, the timelines or the narratives are vastly different. To understand modern French history, France as of 2021, you don't have to go back to the Middle Ages. You just have to go back to the Grand Revolution and its consequences. To understand Germany as of 2021, you don't have to go back to the Holy Roman Empire, but you have to go back to the late 19th century, and so forth. So Russia is quite unique, even though it's not wholly unique, in that to understand notions and its history, its actions as of the 21st century is concerned, you have to go back to at least 500 years, and in many ways, to understand what I was mentioning, the siege mentality, you have to go back 800 years. There's no way around that. And for most countries, that is not the case, because they don't have such grievances that are dragging down and kept alive. When I was mentioning the war, well, very quick war with the Swedes, and the memory of that is kept alive by generations very consciously. Not only, and certainly it would be false to blame anything on the current regime, because that was kept alive by Catherine the Great, for example, who herself was, as we know, very much non-Russian, but hey, ruling dynasties were seldom connected to the soil and blood they were ruling. So there is nothing unique in that. One can even point out that notions about China and Kazakhstan is that, oh my God, the Chinese, and I'm generalizing, of course, before anyone would comment on that, the Chinese are invading, the Chinese are taking over, the Chinese been doing this for, well, wait a second, it was actually us who were raiding them, not the other way around. But, you know, they're big, we have this weird memory of them. So, you know, and there are great many examples of that. Notions about the East are very different for Russia for two main reasons. One, it did conquer the East, period. It just did. Two, there is this big other entity in the South that it never tried to conquer, that was China. So relations were very, very different. There is this Russian relations with China and the various Chinese states for the past 400 years were, well, mutual respect, mutual, never interdependence. It was very, very different. There was no threat from Russia. One can, of course, say that there's a popular notion in Siberia that what will happen when the Chinese will flock in and will open all their shoe shops, to bring a terrible semi-racist cliche. Well, that is something new, but aside from that, the relations were always different. And there's a third element to it. Russia never wanted to look like China. Russia, for the past 300 years, since the time of Peter the Great, that opened the window to the east, that was St. Petersburg, west. It was trying to emulate Europe, and this was changing through the late 19th century, when notions also that, well, we are unique in no small part thanks to the French invasion and later on the Crimean War, that left this very deep imprint that, well, we're trying to emulate them and copy them, and French culture, for example, is above everything, not French pop music, now that Daft Punk is a thing of the past. And, well, they are attacking us. How can we handle that? But once again, there was never the case with China. And I mentioned China because that was the state there, that was the unconquerable. There was no attempts to the south. Russia did conquer what it could before bouncing off from the British sphere of influence, or the Brits bouncing off the red. That's a long history of the great game. To the east, it did conquer the, well, various tribes, and there were minor khanates. So that was a very, very different relationship. The West was something Russia aspired to become for about 200 years. And then, of course, things changed, but that was a very, very different relationship.
I think Russia wanted to aspire even in the 1990s. I mean, the whole, well, Russia has always wanted to be in the European club. It, from time to time, looks east, and but since Peter the Great, that's just been the case. Okay, other questions? Questions, comments, musings?
Well, questions are coming. I would say it's not Russia. It's more often Petersburg, which looked to Europe. Moscow has more of a schizophrenic relationship with this. Yeah.
And of course, as we'll know, Vladimir Putin is, well, himself, and much of the regime was coming from St. Petersburg, to add a little twist to that story.
Yes. Yeah. No. I meant to imply that wholeheartedly. Yeah. I mean, Putin's experience, Petersburg or not, his own career was very much in Europe, and a particular frame of Europe as well, for that matter. And that has come up in many different discussions. It's not clear with the Polish discussion often that whether they're afraid of his German proximity or his Russian prowess, which one is the one they should feel more threatened by. So there are many details always within it.
Yes, even though, yep, sorry.
No, I'm saying somebody had either raised a hand or just congratulated you with a thumbs
Just to
up.
quickly reflect on that as well, I think it's very important what you just said. There is a generational difference between Navalny and Putin. There is more than 20 years, or 20 years separating them. So Putin, as anyone in the world, all of us, been shaped by his own experiences. As you mentioned, for example, being a KGB agent in East Germany. Navalny was addressing questions, and his worldviews were shaped by the 90s, the collapse, and then when we talk about, for example, his views on migrants, well, those were shaped because there was a large number of Central Asian migrants arriving from the early 2000s to Russia. So, of course, it's very much true that everyone is shaped, and all politicians are shaped by their own experiences, and very often they try to find solutions to questions posed even decades ago, because that is their experience. Of course, this is once again a generalization, but it is very much true in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the more data coming from within Russia about the attitude towards Central Asia and so on. And we had this very, very interesting talk a couple of years ago by Maslov, who showed the data that how little the urban Russians, sorry, I didn't mean urban, Russia's West, generally speaking, people did not even think about Central Asia or Asia in general as something that they had a connection with whatsoever. They did see them as separate, countries, and not as part of the legacy, as often people talk about. And the data particularly showed the difference between what happened around economic crisis. So when there is an economic crisis, people believe that these people are competing for jobs for them, with them, and they see them as a threat. And on the other times, when they are more, let's say, prosperous, they're happy to have cheap help around. So these attitudes at the ground level, at the level of people, are not neither fixed nor, grounded in some kind of a historical perspective. They're looking at, I think that's perhaps what Jakub was trying to say as well. So we need to separate what people think versus what the policy power side and how power side taps into these specific changes. And I think that's what I would say Navalny is better at, right? Tapping into each of these moments, whatever is going on, and picking up and rejecting and readopting.
Any other comments? I mean, in general, I find the whole, while people think about their comments or questions, we still have 7 minutes, so we still have Jerry for a few more minutes. I find it quite interesting that we are willing to separate foreign policy, economy, domestic politics, and in general democracy. We can put them in different, somehow, at least right now, that's what we're doing with Russia. We're putting all of these categories in different sort of places, and then somehow they're not supposed to link into each other, or they don't have an effect on each other. And I find that absolutely bizarre, especially because we've seen what's happened in the last 4 years in the US, 6 years in India, last I don't know how many years in Turkey. That somehow these things can be kept separate is astounding to me. It's no longer a place where we can say, well, we don't know what's going to happen. I remember these conversations in India. We didn't know what was going to happen. But now we know what's going to happen if you bring in people who can say things like this. And even with the economy, economies are very much tied with the question of migrant workers and domestic workers. So I'm not sure how one is able to just keep them separate. They're not separate. Jerry, do you think that that's valid, or am I being emotional?
Well, I think in many ways democracy is overrated, as for example the Gulf states represented fairly well as the joke went. What do we want in 10 years ago? Democracy. When do we want it? Your happy hour, if we can afford that. If people are served by the state, simplified, as far as economic development, and I think for most part, in most countries that don't have that crystal clear, rather rock solid foundations for democracy, and even then, they have a tendency to overlook other, well, let's say, shortcomings. And I think this is what, when you mentioned Turkey, for example, the government was extremely lucky that it was riding the waves, surfing very neatly of one of the greatest developments in Turkish history for the past 100 or so years. And now it is suffering because the economy is not going that well. And frankly, for most part, it's not much to do with the government. Similarly, it was also very lucky to benefit from it, and it did not have that much to do with it. Once again, I'm simplifying extremely. So I think there is definitely a danger that voters are more than willing to overlook shortcomings if they are served well, because, well, what's the problem? We have great salaries, everything is nice, and the sun is shining. And this is, of course, back to Navalny a little bit, the clear message for many in Russia is that, well, things are not necessarily going that well, thanks to sanctions, thanks to the economy never being reformed and still extremely being tied to the export of natural resources and so forth. Paradoxically, to break up that system would cause a lot of pain in the short and mid-term. But while people are facing massive inflation, they're facing with a weak ruble and sanctions that did help lots of businesses. Russian cheese, for example, nowadays comes in great varieties. They have a tendency to look far more critically. There is a shortcomings of the regime when it comes to kleptocracy and corruption as they were before. But here's the twist, then they're also far more willing to overlook the shortcomings, as you were mentioning, of people who are willing to fix it or offer to fix it, because, well, there is a grand goal. So what really matters is achieving it. The path and the circumstances matter far less. And there's definitely a danger in that.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 minutes left, but I think that was a really good place to stop. So I think I'll take this opportunity to thank everybody. Thank Jerry. We apologize for all the internet issues. Somebody clearly didn't want us to have this conversation. Thank you again for sticking with us. We'll be back here again next week with another Cambridge alumni, Nikolai Murashkin. I'll send out the announcement soon. Thank you again, and thank you, Jerry. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.